we have a few people online, and a few people might be walking in as we begin. So thank you for joining us online, and thank you to Paul and colleagues forthcoming. I'm going to talk a bit about at least as I see it, and as my colleagues potentially see it, the evidence for and against the many debates that we're having with smartphones. It's quite a heated debate at the moment, as we all know, with potentially some conflicting evidence. But just before I get into it, I'll talk a little bit about our work in DCU in Dublin City University. So ABC, the Anti-Bullying Centre, it's a research institute which has the UNESCO chair on bullying and cyberbullying, as well as the home for the International Journal of Bullying Prevention. A lot of our research has been involved heavily with industry, with the Irish government, as well as kind of traditional academic, like kind of major grants as well. And a lot of the stuff that we're doing often is looking at the UK and particularly the big tech world that is in Dublin, Silicon Valley, and thinking about how we can evolve online safety. And there has been some excellent developments as well. So we have our finger on that pulse, as well as in the School of Psychology, where I'm based, as well as sitting in the ABC. We're doing a lot of stuff in the tradition of PPI, public patient involvement. We have a new program in psychology and disruptive tech, trying to empower students with methods from both worlds. But at least as I'm reading the evidence, I'm kind of seeing two positions. I'm being deliberately simplistic here, perhaps, but smartphones and social media are inherently bad for children, and we can't wait for the evidence to tell us what we already know, either anecdotally or with emerging evidence. We can't wait any longer to uncover such harms. Position two, the best quality, more longitudinal evidence doesn't show the strong cause and effect relationships that one would expect before pushing forth macro policy change. I will try in this talk to be somewhat diplomatically sitting between them, I hope. I at least inform you about some ongoing research that we have that tries to navigate that. But we're probably all faced with this sort of stuff. Whether you're a researcher, parent, computer scientist, lobbyist, NGO, we see kind of these medicalized headlines, tech addiction and digital heroin for kids, likewise generations being destroyed, ruined, and huge causal language implicit within those narratives. And then we also have the academics on major projects. For example, the representative EU Kids Online sample about 10 years ago now, more emerging evidence from the Oxford Internet Institute saying that actually there are no causal links when you look at this stuff. With the razor sharp focus of sophisticated regression models over time, we don't see the evidence. So I'm going to try and just give somewhat of a snapshot of that to segue into some ongoing research that we have in Ireland to try and capture that, mainly to build up with this point about how the voice of the young person is built into into these debates. So I hope that will be contextually relevant for all things age assurance, but also more broadly as well. Which it's an easy thing to say, but as I hope I'll make clear, that how and where we involve children is not at all an easy thing to execute. It's easy to say, but not necessarily to execute. But just a little deep dive on that first position, and it's interesting timing as social psychologist in New York, Jonathan Haidt just is releasing a book, or just released this book rather, The Anxious Generation, with a very specific kind of premise. There's been a literal rewiring of childhood. We've departed from play and we've gone to a phone-based childhood, which particularly in and around 2010, 2012 has literally caused a rewiring such that addiction, social contagion, particularly gendered effects with females experiencing worse outcomes. All of these things are caused by the smartphone. And that was a similar premise with the Twenge book in 2017 as well. So, and that sort of spike, whatever happened in and around that time frame, we see many, many line graphs here, there, and everywhere, including this one. And you may, so this is the suicide rate percentage change since 2003, broken down by age and sex from a 17-country sample. The first thing that obviously jumps out is this spike, and for one particular group, in this case, female teens, in and around 2013-14. There's also another issue with how the data is presented. When we look at the frequencies here on the kind of top left, we don't get the same alarmist type of inference that we would get from the line graph. So we have just a very basic use of frequencies by so 3.5 females per 100,000, in contrast to what is simply a log interval there on the line graph. And it's just these types of cause and effect inferences that can have an immediate impact on either parents or policymakers alike. So that's just a little snapshot into at least some of the premises coming from that position. Going against that directly and perhaps in search of other hypotheses, there is position 2, which might start. So I'm thinking in particular of Amy Orban's work here, which is kind of saying for all of time we have had a new technology, and you can go back to when books were first actually proliferating across society, and there were articles saying this is going to ruin the brains of childhood. You can go all the way back to that, right through to each iteration of whether it's TV, radio, etc. And this a similar cycle of panic and the political outsourcing thereof leads to kind of this wheel of reinvention. Meanwhile, the evidence gives us a much more kind of complex picture. And it kind of says things like this: casual medicalized language like the dopamine hit just isn't reflective of the mechanism. There is no singular study, apart from mice, that is showing that you're getting a dopamine hit when you get that like from Instagram. Yes, the reward system in the brain is invoked, but to call it a dopamine hit that is different to you and I sharing a joke upon entry, it doesn't really justify this type of language. Screen time addiction is a similar principle. And the many moral panics and even indeed entrepreneurships that spin from this in industry settings as well. As per the last graph, these different thresholds, your evidence or mine in terms of cause and effect relationships, all of which kind of when we talk about the pedantic measurement of all of these issues makes it a very contentious area, such that many people conclude these are associative relationships. X and Y happen at the same time doesn't mean it is caused by one. And interesting evidence from Amy Orban and colleagues would suggest that if your life satisfaction decreases, your social media use will increase, but the reverse is not necessarily the case. And as a consequence of all this likely complexity, which is of course not to deny any of the clear harms that we know are out there and high prevalence in certain subgroups, we risk having unintended consequences with the more one-size-fits-all policy response. In particular, the digital rights of the child, what you might call generation-defining social interactions. So live streaming a Twitch game with a group of friends is just a social interaction that could never have been conceptualized by the parents of that child. And it could be a very important community, but would never be perceived as such by the parents. That might be changing. And likewise, the politics of enforcement, which we're now seeing creep into the smartphone ban or pact debate. And then similarly, the best global data, at least on this, that I've read, again from Oxford Internet Institute, which thankfully has included Global South, which has always been missing from the debate. Again, no causal relationship between the introduction of the internet and well-being of young people. Just under 100% of a child's well-being has nothing to do with how much time they spend, which we can logically infer, say it's what they're doing and how they are doing it. That becomes the million-dollar question. So that's, in a nutshell, the sorts of things that we've been chewing on as researchers as we've seen the Irish context begin to navigate this debate. And there's been lots of national coverage of, okay, let's make a pact, bottom-up pact, parents, schools and children, make a pact not to bring in smartphones into childhood. So not even just schools, into childhood. Let's say up until the age of 12, the smartphone doesn't exist. And this has gotten a lot of coverage, despite there being, at least in our case, not much or no evidence. One ongoing project that we're just concluding has been looking at the media narrative on this. So we took a snapshot of some of the broadsheets and tabloids and one kind of major online outlet in Ireland with the kind of a coding structure based on that prior literature, finding that most of the output doesn't even reference any of those macro pieces of evidence, whichever way it goes. And of the literature that is presented, it is one sort of narrative that smartphones are inherently bad in some way, shape or form. Perhaps more worryingly, only 15% in some way reference the child's voice. So that could be an indirect reference or likewise a direct quote. And again, lots of associations with harms. So it's always couched in terms of harms. So that particular shape to the narrative, we would wonder what that does to both the parent/political debate as these policies evolve. And as I said, there is no specific empirical or qualitative research on the potential impact of these bans. And there's a conflation between a ban versus a pact, so a no smartphone in childhood as a whole pact, versus the natural restrictive smartphone policy that would be in any classroom. Keep the phones in the bags, please. So we've just started a mixed method study on this. We would have loved to present some data today, but ethics and applied field work is such that we are where we are. But we do have a between group comparison with voluntary smartphone bans, so a formalized ban within a school, versus schools that don't have these bans. I'm particularly interested in comparing the empirical data with what the experience was like for both staff and students. So we have this across a cluster of schools in Ireland, with the data due come the end of this summer, we hope. The whole kind of point of me just trying to outline the debate, at least as we see it, is to think about kind of the guiding ethos that we have, and then listening to some of the amazing work of the likes of Professor Sonia Livingstone, for example, the voice of the child within all of this. In the way that we often critique industry for saying things like, yes, we know this is a very serious issue and we're taking it very, very seriously, and then plowing ahead with the business model regardless. We're used to these kind of dynamics. And I would ask the same thing of all stakeholders in terms of their involvement of young people. This is what one kind of long-standing model for any sort of user involvement, this kind of ladder of participation, where we, at the bottom of it, we risk outright tokenism. Come on in and talk to us about our new smartphone policy, and then we'll give you a nice lunch and a nice notebook, and then we'll wave you goodbye, and then we'll put in our transparency reports that we've consulted young people. Now that's the cynical perspective, right through to, please literally co-design with us this new mental health tool in our app that we will then transparently report on what you have done, and then roll that out, or at least test it in-house. And I don't think we have any really good data to evidence how young people have been involved throughout some of the most impactful policies and technologies that will define their generation. And there's very good reasons for that as well. Parents, of course, have, and likewise policymakers, of course, have a natural power dynamic that is important as well. It's not always easy to include a young person's voice. There are ethical issues. There's many, many issues implicit with this. And some of the ongoing research that we have in DCU, this is Orla McGovern, she's a PhD researcher with myself, and is looking at the specific methodology that is co-design. Thankfully, on a very positive project, how can we use, in her case, TikTok for a force for good in terms of promoting mental health help seeking, for which there are many impactful hashtags. So Orla is looking at specifically at how do people and the literature talk about this thing called co-design. And the kind of tentative insights that we're gaining so far, this is year one of the project, is that there's a highly variable and interchangeable use of this thing called co-design. So we simply don't know if a bunch of young people, or youth councils, or youth co-design groups, or NGO-based youth groups are invited in to either a state policy making or a big tech entity. If they're invited in to have their voice heard, there is no best practice, gold standard methodology for capturing that interaction throughout the life cycle. In the way that your classic design thinking 5-step approach would say, let's empathize with the user, take on their feedback, build it in, and then we reiterate it if necessary. We need to get to a gold standard where we can see how the voice has been captured and either rejected or not. And thinking about that in terms of the same quality of evidence that we have for many other areas. And this aligns quite nicely actually with a recent report from Sonia Livingstone and colleagues regarding the best interests of the child. And the classic conflation here is that the best interests of the child is often just about the prevention of all the bad stuff. And actually there's a very crucial distinction here, certainly in terms of key developmental psychology stages, but also many other areas of how a child should rightly flourish in an online space. And these emerging best practices that we're hearing a lot, of course, about safety by design. And we're seeing a lot of good practices in Australia, UK, for example. But I would argue that when we're thinking about child-centric approaches, co-design and playful by design, we need to think about how we can evidence that in such a way that we can capture the voice of the child both ethically and to a high standard of evidence, all the while bearing in mind the threats of the ladder of participation. What predicts positive outcomes? I mean, my bias is in the psychological literature. Anything in a therapeutic setting would say that you need that alliance with the child. One of the most efficacious treatments ever is cognitive behavioral therapy, collaborative inquiry. So it's that complex triangle between the tech, the child, and the parent, and how they are all having their voices heard, that would lead to the most sustainable outcomes. And I have my last slide before I kick it over to anyone who has a question. Yeah, it's just some tentative recommendations, regardless of where your own standing might be on those earlier positions. It would be very useful to see what that might tell us about any underlying confirmation bias that we may have and what that might be doing to how we do policy. Less is more, perhaps. That could be a very valid position in terms of how children are interacting with tech, but rather this will still be a component of their day-to-day. I sometimes provoke by saying maybe the age assurance debate is a red herring. Maybe if we get the age assurance debate wrong, but we get the responses to harm correct, we'll be in a slightly different place. And as ever, the transparency with all of these steps is absolutely crucial. So I will stop there, and thank you for listening. And thank you to all those online.
Hi, I was just wondering, the evidence coming in so far is mixed. Is there a surge in studies at the moment? You might have mentioned at the beginning, but are people trying to find answers at the moment by commissioning more studies?
There's a lot happening at the moment. It still tends to be dominated by kind of Western model of research, which is what that global set study was fascinating. We are seeing more sophisticated longitudinal models as well, which are harder to they're harder to do, but they do give us that more sophisticated pattern over time. But it's a highly active research area. The challenge always been, what's the golden standard of measurement? So we're moving away from screen time, because what is screen time really? And there's a great quote from Sonny Livingstone about, what if they're reading Shakespeare 9 hours a day? You know what I mean? Screen time, we've really departed from it, and then people naturally go to something like, okay, active versus passive use. Social media, like the ubiquitous nature of something like a TikTok scroll versus a live stream active game. These are very, very different concepts. So yeah, the fields are kind of subdividing into each of those components to try and figure out where, because it's a very complex multi-factor model really.
Yeah. How much do you find politics comes into play with it? Because obviously, well, I'm not sure much about Ireland, but I know in the UK, obviously there's pushing the ban. In the US, it's something that politicians kind of jump onto because it can be a vote winner. Do you find that kind of affects the level of attention that the evidence is getting? So the stuff that kind of goes against the grain of what everyone thinks in the newspapers, does it get dialed down? Does it kind of get pushed to the side, or do other politicians are actually maybe a bit more level-headed and looking at both sides? Or
yeah, I think because two things can be true at the same time. There can be politicization of something that has a well-intentioned motivation in the first instance. So we know there are harms associated with smartphones, and then that becomes politicized because yes, you can garner a lot of votes from early parent communities because of this alarmist type of narrative that is there. We absolutely see that. I suppose what's interesting about the US example is that the kind of legally, the companies now have to evidence how they have not caused harm, which is a very important kind of difference. But at the same time, and as per that content analysis, we just don't hear anything from the children within any of these narratives. So if it's a political parent top-down exercise, I was listening to John's talk earlier, and he mentioned something about in the way that pornography websites simply have this is now adult content, over 18s only. That is literally an advertisement, an enticement to come on in. So the very things that we try and do not to invite young people on board could actually entice them. So I often wonder about that kind of, if it's a ban, at least in a school setting, would that 10, 11-year-old really be staying off technology between now and going home? And what does that do? So many unintended consequences potentially. Thank you for the questions.